Hello, hello. Are we good to go? Alrighty then. So if you have your phones, pull them out. We're going to do another exercise. All right. So if you have your phones, go ahead and open up google.com. Whoops. All right. We're going to be doing a little quick exercise on a poem. So go ahead and open up Google, and then we're going to read a famous poem. I'm going to just read it to you first, and then I'm going to have you Google it. Okay? So you can't read anything about it early. Does somebody want to open us up in prayer before we begin?
Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this evening of study and coming together, Lord, to fellowship with the Lord. We just commit our time with you and those who are probably tuning in and joining us on the web. Pray, Lord, that this will be a very, very fruitful night for us as we come together. Until then, as it leads us, thank you and give back to the Lord of praise in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to play us. I'm going to do a little bit of an exercise so we can see just how easy it is to characterize something. Give me a second here. So I'm going to play a little bit of something. Okay. Okay. Okay, listen. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children, eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Does anybody know who wrote that poem? I'm going to read it again. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children, eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or lest every man be blind. Does anybody know who wrote that poem? Huh? Yeah, but you're cheating. Somebody who didn't Google it yet. It's a famous poem, right? So this is also an illustration of if somebody's quoting a poem in Scripture, if you don't know who wrote it and it's famous, right? You're coming in without any experience, right? But oftentimes in the Bible, you're reading a passage or a story that's referencing a very familiar, famous story, right? And all of the meaning and all of the significance of that story that's been instilled to them because of history and culture and growing up as a Jewish boy or girl or whatever, you don't have it, right? You don't have that background. So we're coming in completely blind, right? So this is a famous poem. It's one of the most famous poems by this famous poet. But we, most of us, are coming in blind, right? Who is this? It's Emily Dickinson. So this is a famous, of all of the poems of Emily Dickinson, this one feels so direct. What's the name of the poem? Okay, so now go and Google Emily Dickinson's poem. Now don't read any meanings. That's cheating, right? So look up the poem, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Just look up the text, right? Don't read any summaries. Don't cheat, okay? Don't rob yourself of the ability to read this poem as it goes. So someone read it one more time for me. Yeah. So I'm going to read it one more time, now with, instead of rain, something else. Okay, I'm going to read it one more time, but loud. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Okay? And I'm playing thunder in the background. Okay? What can you observe about the form? There's a meter. There's a rhythm to it. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children ease, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Right? There's a rhythm to it. There's also couplets. They're quatrains. Right? Is there a rhyme scheme? Not an obvious one, right? But the second lines of the second line of each couplet is a rhyme: lies, surprise, kind, blind, right? The other ones are not so straight, right? What do we think this poem is about immediately on first pass? Truth, okay? Last week we also talked about truth, but in the form of love, right? Of all the poems that Emily Dickinson wrote, this one is a little funny because it feels so direct. It's about truth, right? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. But Dickinson, if you know anything about Dickinson, what is she known for? Okay? Emily Dickinson, as a poem, was very troubled, sickly, reclusive. She's also known deeply for her complex poems, and specifically, she's known for her ambiguity. Right? So this is, if you know Dickinson's work, this one feels strangely direct, because her work is known for ambiguity. Right? She does odd manipulations in meter. Where there's meter, right? Like we saw, but instead of ending on down, the first one ends on a down, and then the last quatrain ends up, right? Lies, surprise, kind, blind, right? She's manipulating meter. She also manipulates rhyme. There's a rhyme on every second line, but not on every first, right? And oftentimes the images she uses are very mysterious. They're not clear. And sometimes they feel out of place. One time she'll be talking about a horse carriage with death on it, and then a field of flowers, right? And a little bit of out of place. Not so much here, right? It's poetry that is Emily Dickinson. She obviously wrote it, but it's brimming with slant truth. In other words, poetry that puts into practice the very philosophy that the poem is about, that's seemingly laid out there in the first line. Tell the truth, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Right? It's seemingly laid out here. Tell all the truth. It's in perfect meter and in matching rhyme. Right? It strikes me as odd that the poem which best describes this philosophy is the one in which she abandons its most slantness, right? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, but she tells one of her most perfect technical poems, right? She's not manipulating meter as heavily as she does in other poems. She's also not manipulating rhyme as heavily as she does in other poems. She almost abandons the philosophy of tell all the truth, but tell it slant, and in this way she is telling her truth slant. On first read, it appears that Dickinson is so intent on getting her point across that she repeats it 4 times, right? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. So tell the truth, but a little bit off kilter, right? But then also success in circuit lies, right? Lies is a play on words for lying, but also circuit. What's a circuit? Roundabout, right? Roundabout. And then there's the truth, there's the superb surprise of truth that is too bright for our own fragile or weak or sickly delights. And then, as lightning to the children ease with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Right? So she's so intent on getting her point across that she tells it 4 times. The first line is the most naked of her assertions, which is what? What does she say? Tell the whole truth, but tell it indirectly, right? Tell it indirectly. Tell all of your truth. She's begging you. It's a command. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, right? Tell the whole truth, but tell it indirectly. Then in line 2, she says the same idea in another way. Success in telling the truth lies in a circuitous journey, not a direct one, right? Your success in telling the truth lies in its circuitous telling. It's roundabout, repetitive, winding journey, not the direct one. So not blunt, right? In lines 3 and 4, she describes the failure of the direct approach. If we went direct, our delights were too weak to hold it, right? It's too bright for us, too weak for our unstable capacities for delight, right? The surprise of direct truth is too bright, right? It will, in other words, short-circuit us, right? A direct path will short-circuit us. And finally, in lines 5 through 8, she hammers the point home again using what as a metaphor? Lightning. What's the image? Yeah. The apprehension of truth. So what is this line saying? 5, 6, 7, and 8. Sure, but don't interpret it yet. Just what's happening in the lines 5, 6, 7, 8. Children are afraid of lightning, so They are explained lightning to, right? Lightning and thunder is explained to children. So the apprehension of truth must be gradual, says Emily, like a parent's explanation of lightning to children, right? It must be gradual. It eases children when you explain to them, right? Rather than the lightning itself, which is the most direct version of lightning, right? If you look at lightning directly, it would blind the viewer. It would scare the children, right? Whereas explaining over time to children will get them to be less and less afraid and to understand the light. After these 4 phrasings, the meaning could not be more clear, right? What's the point? What are they trying to say? Sure, but a little bit more than just be truthful, that there is a truth that is worth telling, right? It has to do with our delight, right? There's something for us that's worth knowing, right? And it's worth telling people. But it cannot be presented head on. It can't be presented head on, right? It must come at an angle, an oblique one, off the side, if the writer hopes to have any chance at success in communicating the truth, right? It has to come at the most direct angle. Most indirect angle. That's sort of the point, right? That's what the writer is trying to get at, which you could actually end there. That could just be the meaning of the poem. But actually, that's the direct meaning of the poem, right? The direct meaning of the poem is tell in truth indirectly. That's the paradox of this poem. The most direct meaning of this poem is trying to communicate to you that it's worth telling truths, but at an angle, not directly, because it's too bright to give to you all at once. But that's the direct meaning, which means that we have just read it, but we haven't understood it, right? Because Emily Dickinson always does this in her writing. She has something hiding up her sleeve. What do you think is hiding up Emily Dickinson's sleeve in this poem? Right? The direct meaning of the poem is tell the truth at a slant. That's already, it's a play, right? She's messing with us here. So let's read it back again. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Right away in the first line, the one that seems the most overt, Dickens is planting a seed of ambiguity. What's the seed of ambiguity? Yeah, what's the ambiguous thing?
Should I tell them the truth or not?
Okay, the seedling of ambiguity here is the ambiguity of whatever all is referring to. What does it mean? What does all refer to? Does it refer to all of the truth, as in the whole truth, right? As we have said before. Does it refer to tell them all the truth, the whole? Or does it mean, right? Does it mean tell all, tell the whole? Tell the whole truth? What else could it mean? To everyone, right? Tell all the truth, right? Tell everyone the truth. Tell everyone the truth? It's a small bit of uncertainty, right? It's a small one. Is it the whole truth or is it to everyone? Right? That's the ambiguity. It's a small bit of uncertainty, but that's the point. It's a little crack. It's a little crack in the poem that foreshadows things to come. Okay? Right? Success in circuit lies. Okay? What's the second line about? Things get wobblier in the second line. In a poem about truth, there's a word that's the opposite of truth. Lie. Lies. Right? The word lies sticks out like a sore thumb when we're talking about truth. Right? Success in circuit lies. Right? The sentence invites us to read it as reside or to be found, right? Lies. It rests there, right? Success resides in circuitousness, in roundabout journeys. But, as Emily Dickinson writes, and, as many literary professors have pointed out, the speaker doesn't seem to realize that she actually also says circuit lies too, right? That's the phrasing, success in circuit lies, right? She actually says circuit lies. And so the line, in effect, contains its own contradiction. Success in circuit, to tell the truth, that's where it's found, but also circuit lies. It contains its own contradiction, right? Circuit is an important image in Dickinson's work. If you don't know Dickinson's work, then you don't know that the word circuit is important. She often portrays death as a circuit-riding preacher. This is important. Yeah, it's capitalized, right? So this is interesting. This is a prominent figure in her writing. So circuit is an important image, right? Circuit. It's an important image in her work, often contrasted with another figure, which she'll write in other poems, circumference. We're just trying to understand one poem, but Dickinson uses these images all over her work, right? You can't understand her work in a vacuum, right? What is circumference? What's circumference?
It's around the circle.
Yeah, it's around. Right. What is circuit? Well, circuit is the circle, right? Circuit is the circle. Circumference is the measure around the circle, right? And so circuit, if somebody ends the circuit, what does that mean?
It's done.
It's done. Somebody ends the circuit. And so we often say the circle of life, right? This is an image in her work, right? So if one completes the circuit, what does that mean?
You're done. It's complete.
It's complete. If you say that this person has finished the circuit, what does that mean?
So if you're an athlete, so you finish from one point to the other.
Sure, but if I'm writing a poem about a man who's lived a life and now has thus completed the circuit, yeah, life's done, right? So the circuit is life as we know it. So long as you're riding the circuit, you're living. You're in the process of life. And circumference is outside. It's the outer limit of the circuit, right? So what could that mean? The outer limit of experience. So if this is the circuit, so this is how you read Dickinson. So this is a circuit. Right? Everything that I do in here is life. Right? What's out here? What lives in the circumference? Huh? Yeah, outside your life, which is things that I don't know, things that I can't experience, things that I don't have access to. In Dickinson, it's oftentimes outer limits of life, but also God and truth. It's outside of what I know. If what I know is because of the circuit, anything on the outside of the circuit, I don't know it, right? So this is often the tenuous boundary between human beings and what we can understand and what we can't. If I don't know it, I don't know it, and it's lost to me, right? And infinity or truth with a capital T, not a small t, right? And so Dickinson has a deeply ambivalent relationship with circumference as a poet. Meaning, what does ambivalent mean?
You're
It's,
fickle-minded,
yeah.
or
Yeah, it could be this or it could be that. Like if you're ambidextrous, you can write with both hands. It could be this hand, it could be that hand. So Dickinson, as a poet, has an ambivalent relationship with truth, with the circumference. Sometimes she thinks it's simpler to live life in the circuit, stick with what you know. But sometimes she has this deep crushing weight of anxiety and fear surrounding what she doesn't know, right? With what happens after death. Oftentimes, in her best and most bright poetry, she's content with life and what she knows and what she's experienced. But on the other hand, she's crushed by all the books she doesn't know how to read or languages she'll never learn, right? And it's dangerous to live with curiosity of the outside, right? At other times, she proclaims, "My business is circumference." She writes that in a letter at one point to a friend of hers, right? My business is circumference, meaning my business is knowing what's out there. I'm so interested in all those things. Here, amazingly, she manages to condense that idea of her relationship with circumference into just 4 words: success in circuit lies, right? She condenses her relationship with that without losing any of the complexity, right? Her success lies in the circuit, but it also lies, right? And then she goes on to say, "Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise." What's that getting at? The immediate thing you notice is that the sentence is flipped, right? It should say, "The truth's superb surprise, too bright for our infirm delight." But she says it backwards. So the final word is surprise. You don't actually get the true meaning of the sentence till you finish it, right? Oftentimes you read a sentence, and then you get where it's going, right? But here, the surprise is at the end. It comes as a surprise. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. The truth is a surprise, Dickinson says, one that is too bright for our delight. And literally, what does delight look like? On the page, what does it look like? Delight, right? Like the subtraction of light, right? Too bright for our delight. An emotion that is inherently weak and feeble. It's actually infirm, right? Our delight is infirm. It's about now when things start to fall off the rails for the poem, right? Because if truth is a surprise, a word that originally meant, do you know where the word surprise comes from? What's the root of the word surprise? What other words end like that? Reprise. What's a reprise? Actually, that's what it means now based on analogy, but originally, what's a reprisal? It's an attack. So a reprise is if you attack, the reprise is the hit back. What's a surprise? It's an attack that you did not expect, right? Only now on analogy, because our language is so metaphoric, we can say a surprise is like a pleasant surprise. That's why the phrase eventually developed to say pleasant surprise, because surprise is not actually positive on its own. Its denotation is not positive. Its connotation can be positive, right? But it means an attack. So this word surprise is a word that originally meant an attack without warning. And so here, truth is a surprise that is too bright for us, actually.
So in music, when you say reprise now, it means sing it again as your closing sound, because you do a reprise.
Yes, and so this is what I say when the English language is not really, it's not technically literal, right? The English language all the time has adjacent meanings that are not the original meanings, and they only have the new meaning because of the original meaning. Do you see what I'm saying? The reprisal only has the sense of repeat once more because of the original meaning, which is another attack, right? And so that's a metaphor, technically. It's a dead metaphor, right? It doesn't need to be explained, but it's a metaphor nonetheless. So our language is constantly developing new metaphoric meanings, right? Which is slang. Slang is, until it becomes a dead metaphor, it's a metaphoric meaning, right? In modern language, we say, oh, that is hot, meaning hot, physically hot, it's too hot to touch. But if it's fresh, because it's fresh out of the oven, it's too hot to touch, that's hot, right? Can't touch it, it's too hot. It's fresh, it's new, right? And then we have another word that develops from here. It's modern. I don't know if you guys use it, but maybe Joe uses it. People say that's fire. They go for the more direct, right? That's fire. That thing's fire. And it has something to do with something being hot, but it doesn't have the sense of that's new, right? Fire just means that it's good, right? Yeah, and yeah, so this is how language develops. It will be slang until it becomes a dead metaphor, and then it's just language. It's just English now, right? So language is constantly changing. But here, truth is a surprise. It's a word that originally meant attack without warning, a surprise that's too bright for us. Then, how can anyone grab hold of it in the first place, right, to repackage it slant? If it's too bright for me, how can I even repackage it to be slant? How can I take something that's too bright for me and tell it circuitously? How? If it's too bright and I don't expect it, right? That's the challenge. The word surprise at the end of the phrase almost starts to feel ominous, actually. It's too bright for us. There's a sense of danger. And then I'm infirm, weak, and fragile, right? And then you've gone back to find in the poem what? Thunder and lightning, right? As lightning to the children ease with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Now that we're looking at this poem with some suspicion, because the truth is too bright for us, too bright for our infirm delight, right? And it's the surprise. Now that we're looking at this poem with some suspicion, it's easier to see the problems in the metaphor Dickinson picks out to elucidate her earlier sentiments, right? What's the problem with the metaphor now? She equates telling slant truth to adults easing children about lightning, but the sense is even the adult does not understand the lightning, right? It's a half-truth to appease the children's fear when they have every right to be afraid of it. You see this? It's a slant telling. Parents do this all the time, where they tell a half-truth because they mean well for the kid, but the kid, they have the same relationship to the truth. It's outside the circuit, right? Except it's not the children who are eased here, right? According to the slightly confusing grammar, who is actually eased? Read the sentence using proper English grammar. What's eased? What is being eased? Do you have something, Joe? No? Just look at the line. What's the grammar? What is actually being eased here? It's the lightning. Right? It's the lightning. According to the slightly confusing grammar, the thing that's being eased is not actually the children. It is the lightning being eased. Right? Does an explanation, however kind, actually ease the force of lightning? Because the truth, you're right, it is the truth surprise, because now the truth surprise is the lightning, right? But does telling a kind explanation ease the force of lightning?
For the children?
Yeah.
No.
It does not. It's too bright. It doesn't.
And they don't know really
Yeah. Does it? Yeah. Think about telling the child about lightning. So a few days ago, I was woken by thunder from a distance. Who woke up that evening? Like 4, 2, 3, 4, and it was all night. What I heard was like steel barrels being rolled above the roof. Yeah, right? And so if a child is afraid of those sounds, does telling a kid that it's lightning ease their fear? It doesn't, because a kind explanation does not actually ease the force of the lightning, right? It strikes me that children equipped with feeble emotions, just like the infirm delight, facing a surprise attack from something they cannot possibly understand, that it's so bright that it will blind them, they have good reason to be scared of the thing. And a parent's well-meant, but kind explanation does not ease that fear. Right? They have reason to be scared. All a kind explanation can do is what? What can a kind explanation of lightning do? Yeah, it offers a comforting, but preposterous. What's a preposterous? Like foolish or silly fiction, right? It is a scary thing, whatever lightning and thunder is. And a kind explanation does not ease its danger, right? It's a comfort to kindly explain something, but nonetheless, it's a fiction, right? Because I don't know what the lightning will do or won't do, right? Do you see what I'm saying? This is what Emily Dickinson is trying to get at, is that the lightning actually, the danger of the lightning, the danger that the lightning poses to the child has not lessened because of your explanation. If it strikes the house, it's just as dangerous as it was before you explained it. You see what we're saying?
In the Midwest,
Yeah.
go down because it will be a turning point.
And this is the realization that the last lines of the poem bring home with the phrase dazzle gradually, right? It sounds great with its assonance. What's assonance? What does that mean? So you can a sonance, right? A sonance. No, go. Wait, what? I can't hear you. Yeah, it has something to do with sound, how words sound, right? Like resonance is like, that sounds pleasing. Dissonance is, that sounds disconcerting or off-putting. What's assonance? Nothing, right? Yeah. And so in poetry, it's the repetition of a vowel or a diphthong in non-rhyming stressed syllables. So there's no rhyme to make it sound perfect, but there's a repetition of a diphthong. So there's something pleasant there, but not negative or positive. So it's like dazzle, gra, dazzle gradually, right? That's assonance. And so there's this assonance here which sounds great, dazzle gradually, right? It rolls off the tongue to say it, right? The truth must dazzle gradually. But ultimately, what's the issue with the phrase dazzle gradually? It either dazzles or it's gradual, right? There is no such thing as a gradual dazzling, right? A dazzle is bursts of light that flicker, and you cannot do that gradually, right? Things cannot dazzle gradually, no matter how nicely it sounds, right? That Dickinson is playing with you here because it's too bright for you to hear, and not a kind explanation, not even a kind explanation, which is simply a preposterous fiction, will ease the force of the lightning. So she tells you the truth must dazzle gradually, which we know it cannot do. If it's a surprise and it's superb, it cannot be gradual. You see that? Ultimately, it's oxymoronic. Yeah.
It should, although it is
Yeah.
because
So, exactly. And so now the question is, and at this poem, where are we left? What can we do about truth? Does it dazzle gradually, or is it a surprise attack? Because somewhere between the blindness of seeing the truth and then being blind, and then not ever seeing the truth and being okay, that's where we live, right? Either we see the truth and then we receive it fully, and we're blinded by it, right? And then in between, not seeing the truth and never knowing, right? Remaining children to the truth. And the blindness of actually seeing it. Where are we left? This, I think, is where Dickinson's famous ambiguity comes into play. It leaves you right there with no answers to the truth, right? No actual answers. Something in between blindness and never seeing, right? In one sense, never seeing is blindness, Never seeing the truth is blindness. But on the one hand, seeing the truth renders one blind, right? That's where Dickinson wanted to get us. She essentially wrote a poem that subverts its own point, right? This is not as direct as it appears to be. She told the truth slant, and the truth is, I don't know. It's sort of like the poem we read by who last week? Shakespeare, right? The sonnet. And so she knew all too well, Dickinson knew all too well, that she could try and kindly explain to you truth. But in her poem herself, she knows that it doesn't ease the force of lightning. So she knows that philosophy doesn't work. So she subverts it in her own poem. A kind explanation of her philosophy in relation to truth simply wouldn't work. Her business is the circuit, and it is the circumference. It lies beyond what she knows and what she already knows, right? The poem simply had to display her philosophy, which is her ambivalence to truth. Sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. It's dangerous to know it, but it's just as dangerous to not. Right? Truth is truth. It's a superb surprise whether I like it or not, whether it dazzles gradually or renders me blind. The text, the feeling of the text now, what is the feeling of the poem? What's the emotion conveyed or the feel of the poem? It's destabilizing, right? The poem recognizes the fragility of relationship to truth. It's destabilized from within, oscillating from I know the meaning to I don't know the meaning, from the meaning to the negation of the meaning. Tell the truth, but tell it slant, but also circuits lie, right? That lightning is not eased by the truth, whether the kind explanation comforts the children or not, right? That's Dickinson showing you the lightning. That's Dickinson stepping out onto the circumference and saying, see how difficult it is out here? Glimpsing the truth in an unstable place where language begins to fail our understanding of truth, right? Have you ever tried to communicate something where you didn't quite have the words to communicate it yet? This is where she's talking about. Oftentimes, communicating something that's so true that you'd never uttered it before renders you almost speechless or flabbergasted or without words, right? We have a song that we used to sing in choir called Speechless. There's this astonishment and amazement about God's grace that renders you speechless. It's not that you don't know truth, it's that it's so true that it's difficult to communicate. And actually, I don't know the truth. That's also the thing. I actually cannot. I'll never know, right? There's our knowledge begins to fail us. This is Dickinson's relationship to truth. It's dazzling, right? That's a poem, right? Is it a simple poem? On first read, it is. But on future reads, it's not, right? And this is how Emily Dickinson writes poetry, right? In this circuitous and difficult way. Now, we left our series talking about repeated words, right? This is where we're headed. Did we finish 22 last week? Did we begin 23? No, not yet.
Yeah, we just finished 22. We were talking about.
Oh, I think one of the last things I talked about was, does everybody need to learn Hebrew or something, right? And I said no, and we ended with concordances, correct? Right? And so we're going to now dive into repeated design patterns and repeated words in the Hebrew Bible. Okay? But I have a question for us. What are some different ways to identify where literary units begin and end? Structure? Yeah, so structure can clue us in. Do you have an example? Do you have an example of where structure can help us? Yeah, the way sentences form. There are little time cues like next and then, or some time had passed, right? What other things? Sometimes it's change in form, right? So poems can be a whole unit, right? It's more obvious in places like the Psalms, where they have, some of them have headings, right? Any other ideas?
Repetition.
Yeah, repetition can be that. And then I gave you some concordances. Can somebody read the key question for 23? Joe, did you get a sheet? Oh, yeah, cool.
What's something that stands out to you about how repetition or structure works in Genesis 1?
Okay, so that's where we're going to head today. Okay? So, we're moving forward to reading biblical narrative and specifically how repeated words function, right? So, we're at session 23, and we're at repeated words. Okay, repeated words. So, repeated words function like a thread, right? And then we talked about following the thread of repeated ideas throughout Scripture, right? That's the quilt metaphor. Some threads will run the entire quilt, okay? It's the thread that holds the pieces together and then aligns different pieces next to each other and connects them through linguistic thread, right? And so the metaphor actually really helped me over time of the quilt. It really helped me over time to think about how the biblical story is put together. And a well-known Jewish philosopher and biblical scholar, his name is Martin Buber. He's mostly known for his work called I and Thou. So in the English text, there's a difference between I and Thou, right? And there's a sense that there's you and there's also thou, right? And thy. And so there are these sort of elevated pronouns, right? And these elevated pronouns or these elevated indirect pronouns help us to understand reference and reverence and things like that. But so he's known for his work, I and Thou. His name is Martin Buber. And I don't know if you guys probably don't read too much philosophy, but, and I don't really read a lot of philosophy, but Martin Buber's work is huge for language. So in linguistic studies, he dips into his philosophy dips into linguistic studies, which is my field of interest. And he also produced a translation of the Hebrew Bible into German in the mid-20th century, because German is a really complex language that can string 50 words together into one word. And they can take all kinds of different shapes. You can turn verbs into nouns and nouns into verbs, and it's like Hebrew and Greek in that way, right? And so he wrote an introduction and a whole set of essays that he learned about biblical poetic style in that little project. And he coined a term that's become pretty common in scholarship. And that term is, the translation of it in English is lead word, because in German it's Leitwort, okay? So, Leitwort or lead word. Okay? He's talking about how specific words get elevated prominence in a certain narrative, right? Where a certain inconspicuous word gets special attention within the narrative. And it functions as, if you've ever heard, here, I'll play something for you. So it actually, he developed it from he developed it from a music composition, German music composition. I'm going to play something for you, and then you tell me what this is, okay? Do you know what that is? Mm-mm. I'm going to play another one. I'm going to play another one. Let me play it here. You'll know it once you hear the full thing. I wish I had pulled this up earlier. Here it is. Almost there. This. So this is an example of composition where there's a whole piece and then there's a melody that plays. That's called a leitmotif. And a leitmotif, it's a repeated phrasing within a large composition that's supposed to evoke past iterations of it. So this song is called Gollum's Villainy from Lord of the Rings. And actually what it is a short, it's a low, they spread it out. It's actually slower, a slowing down of the original, which is this. So this is called the Pity of Gollum. This is when Frodo and Gandalf are talking about what will he do with the ring, right? And so whenever you hear this melody, it actually, sometimes it's short, sometimes it's long, sometimes it's only half, but the notes will repeat itself in a certain shape, and it's supposed to remind you of Gollum. And it's supposed to remember that it's actually tragic that Gollum has the ring. He's lived too long. He wasn't supposed to, and now he's twisted, and he's a murderer because of it, right? And so there's so many little bits where this right? That's the sound of the ring when somebody's thinking about it. And so when somebody has the ring in their hand, it actually plays the Pity of Gollum song, because it's supposed to they could be like Gollum, right? That's a leitmotif. And so this particular Hebrew scholar coined a term called a leitwort, right? A lead word. So it's this repeated phrase gets elevated significance in specific narratives, and then they become thematic, right? Like if in Lord of the Rings you go dun 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 dun, dun, right? And that's actually the hero theme. So anytime the fellowship makes a move, they play that, right? And sometimes when the fellowship makes a move that's not quite so good, they play it in minor key. Same motif, but in a minor key to introduce suspicion, right? And so this is where we get thematic movements based on just one word or a repeated phrase. So just like the ring temptation can be a thematic sound and a thematic scene, a thematic word through repetition can become elevated and very, very important, right? So and then especially as you read through the story and as it develops, and as you get more and more familiar with the same phrase, you get added awareness and depth, poetic depth to your read. So he puts it this way, Martin Buber. He says, a lead word is a word or word root. Let me just explain what he means there. Hebrew as a Semitic language, so a Semitic language, this is what I study, is Semitic languages. So Semitic languages, I'm just going to give it to you like this, in shapes. I won't give you Hebrew because it doesn't matter to you. So, okay? So there's 4 characters here, right? Right? Hebrew as a Semitic language. Semitic languages are all these languages that came from historically, maybe not historically, but at least in terms of linguistic etymology or linguistic families, they come from the people of Shem, Semites, okay? Shemites. And so you have Babylonian, Canaanite, Ugaritic, Arabic, Farsi, Syriac, Hebrew, all these languages, Hittite, Assyrian, these are all Semitic languages. They come from the same root languages. Right? So Hebrew as a Semitic language, for the most part, is built off of a system where most of the vocabulary has a basic form, a basic shape. So you can call it like this. This is the root. Okay? This is one word. And then you can take this root and then add something, take it away, change the shape of it, and it's still the root. Right? This root word means nothing on its own. You can turn it into a verb, you can turn it into a noun, you can turn it into a participle with an ing, you can turn it into a phrase, but it's still the root. And so the Hebrew language functions on lead roots. So one word, one root word, can appear 15 times in a sentence as different shapes of itself with the same root word. So repetition is crazy in Hebrew, but not so crazy in English, because we don't have root words like that. Our root words cannot do that, right? So that's a failure, or like it's just a difference in the English language, right? But German has root words. It can do that, right? And so most of the vocabulary in its most basic form in Hebrew has 3-letter root words. That's something that only that Hebrew does, that English does not, right? And then that 3-letter root can get additional letters, right? It can be put on the front, it can be put on the end, it can be put in the middle, and then they become variations of that root. So we can call it like, you have, this is the root word, X, X, X. You can add something here, add something in front of that, and then you get different words every time, right? And it becomes a variation of the root. Do you see that? It's a repetition of the root, but a variation of the root nonetheless. For example, I'm going to give you a word right here, but just in English. I'm going to give you the Hebrew word halak, right? Remember that every character is what? A consonant. It's not a vowel, right? The vowels are implied by the consonants. You see how that makes Hebrew complicated? It makes a lot of Semitic languages complicated because they're consonantal, meaning, like Japanese is different. This is ka, this is ko, this is ki, right? So the consonant stays the same per character, but the vowel changes based on the character. Hebrew's not like that. Hebrew is all consonants, and yeah, just like Yahweh. But what does this make each root word? Depending on what vowels you assign to the consonant, it's a different word. So built into root words in Hebrew is what? Ambiguity. Right? Ambiguity. Without knowing what the consonants are, you don't know what word it is. Right? This is halak. Why I know it's halak is because I know what I'm going to write. Right? I know what I meant by it. You don't know what I meant by it. You could put holok, you could put hilik, you could put all kinds of vowels in there, right? But you don't know what vowels I'm putting in there, but I do, right? So here, the Hebrew word halak, which means to what? It means to walk, okay? It means to walk. So halak means to walk. But if you put the Hebrew equivalent of an M in front of it, if you put the Hebrew equivalent of an M in front of it, so if I put an M here, so mahalak, what does that mean? It actually means distance, okay, right? So halak means to walk, but mahalak means it means a distance. It's a noun. It's a space. Yeah, it's a distance, but the sense is it's a distance that I can walk. Okay? That's the difference, right? It's a walking distance. So it's not just a distance, it's a distance that I can walk. Okay? So you can put letters on the end or in the middle. I can break up the root word, but it's still the root word. And I can create little variant words or nouns or verbs off of the root. Right? It takes a while to get used to in Hebrew, actually. It's one of the earliest challenges in understanding Hebrew, right? It's actually not too dissimilar to how English works in some ways, right? Many languages work this way, where you have a word and you can add a prefix or a suffix to it, and it changes the word altogether, right? And so, give me a word that has ko beginning. It begins with ko. Yeah. Cooperate. Operate, but with co in front of it, what does it mean? To work together, to work it together, right? Or co-dependent, right? You're dependent, but you're actually intertwined and dependent on each other in not so good ways, right? So we have the root word depend or operate, and what does depend mean? It can mean, so this is a practice for you guys. Words don't mean anything on their own, right? The word depend can mean various things. Really depends on how it's used, right? Depends on the context. So words on their own are simply sounds that represent things that we mean by them, right? So like when children don't know words yet, they intend things by sounds and gestures, but they have not assigned the representative sounds and characters to them. So when a baby goes like, "Ma," they could mean food, pick me up, or take me away from here, but we don't know what they mean by it until they learn the language that helps us to communicate together. So a practice for you guys when I ask, what does depend mean? A good answer is, it can mean what? To rely. It can mean to, it depends, right? It could mean that it's contingent on a couple of things, right? What my answer will be contingent on whatever's true, and once I look at all the data, then I can tell you what it will be, but it's going to depend, right? What can it mean? It can also mean diapers in English. It's a brand, right? What can depend also mean? Yeah, and so we have words, right? It can mean I depend on you, right? And we can form a noun off of that. How can we form a noun off of depends? Dependent, right? Which means one who depends. It's a participle, right? So now it's a noun. And now you can put a little Latin preposition in front of it. Co-dependent, one who depends on another in an unhealthy way, right? You depend on me in a way that it's not good anymore, right? So we did 3 things with the root depend. And you can do many other things with the root depend, right? Depending, right? Dependence, independence, right? Right? Undependable, independable, right? It can be a verb, it can be a noun, it can be a noun with a pretty nuanced meaning. So Hebrew is the same way, just in a little bit more complicated way, right? Hebrew is not a mystery language, it's just complicated in a way that we're not used to. So it actually functions the way many languages do with some differences, right? And the point Buber is trying to say is that the biblical authors will not just repeat the Hebrew word. They're actually working at a level below repetition of one word. They're working at the level of repetition of what? Roots, right? They're working at repetition of root words. They'll repeat variations of that word that have the same root. And when you're reading in Hebrew, you see it. How can you see it? How would you be able to see it in Hebrew? The same 3 characters are being repeated multiple times, right? And there are, because those 3 letters of the root. And so it would be if he wrote a whole paragraph story with the same 3 characters in the same order being repeated multiple times throughout the thing in such a way that it's obvious, right? It'd be like if I wrote a sentence, like 3 sentences with depend in the first sentence, dependent in the second sentence, and dependent in the third sentence. You know what I'm trying to get at here. I'm trying to make a relationship between those 3 words, right? The challenge is that our English translation does not render repetition of roots in English, right? That's our issue. In Hebrew, it's quite easy to see it, but in English, it's not, right? They'll use different English words to translate what are connected root words in a given paragraph, right? Again, that's where a commentary or a concordance that accesses Hebrew will help you, right? Well, you search a Hebrew word, and it'll show you all the different glosses. What's gloss? Yeah, gloss, it has everything to do with the word tongue. But when we're talking about this is a gloss, that means this is a specific usage or meaning of a word, or a specific rendering of a word. So you can have one Hebrew word with multiple glosses, right? In English, right? So this is where commentaries and tools will help us. But back to Buber. A lead word is a word or a word root that repeats significantly in a text or a group of texts. And by following these repetitions, one is able to either decipher or grasp the meaning of the text. Decipher in the sense of decoding or piecing together something that's encoded into dense poetry, or grasp, simply to just hold it and then study, right? The repetition may not be of the same exact word, but of the root word, which then intensifies the usage of the story within the story, right? Because the repetition of the root word, but not the specific word, actually will create what? Drama and tension, because the word is then dynamic. The repetition is not static, right? And so you can imagine the entire text stretched out before you, and you can sense the waves moving back and forth as you start to see repeated words through the story. And then on your next pass, you'll notice more of them, and you'll notice little ones where I didn't know before. Like, for example, the redemption motif is all over the place. And redemption not in the sense of spiritual redemption, but the redemption in terms of the first time you see it, which is Exodus, right? And then all the times they were delivered from something before the Exodus, and then after the Exodus. And then when Paul says something in Ephesians like, and we are redeeming the time for the days are evil, it should resonate in a way that it doesn't without knowing the past repetitions, right? And so this is where we have to learn to match the rhythm of the text, right? It's one of the most powerful means of conveying meaning, rhythm and repetition. So let's turn to page 1 of the Bible. Turn to page 1. This is where we'll end for this evening. One of the most well-structured literary units in the entire Hebrew Bible, page 1 of Genesis. Look at it on your screen, on your Bibles, I mean. So the whole point is being able to follow along, right? And noticing repetition and then letting it register, okay? So in Genesis 1, you have an introductory set of statements in verse 1 and verse 2. What are the introductory set of statements? We get a header for the narrative, which is 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A header for the whole narrative. And then verse 2 describes just before the pre-creation state. Right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In verse 2, it hasn't been created yet. Right? So you see how you have it, 2 sections right there, immediately. The Bible begins with 2 sections. First sentence, God created the heavens and the earth. Second sentence, before the beginning, right? A header for the whole narrative, and then verse 2 describes the state before creation. And God's Spirit is hovering in the dark, chaotic waters. And then God said, or even more literally, and. So there's a lot of ands in the first sentence. I mean, in the first book of the Bible. It's the word and. If we were literally translating, it would be in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. He separates. He calls the light darkness. He calls, and there was morning, evening and morning on the second day. Then God said, and then we're going to name the obvious here, Do you notice anything here in what we just read? So there's a lot of repetition of the word and, right? And then the earth was formless and void, darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. And then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, separated light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness night, and there was evening and morning one day, right? Well, last time, what's the second? What's next? Day 5. Verse 6. Right? Well, there's a repetition of an idea, right?
And God said again, and God said.
Right? Then God said, let there be. This time, the rakia. First it was light, the separating of the lights. And then now there's a rakia, a dome or a vault or an expanse. Right? And then God made this, and there was evening and morning the second day. Right? You're getting it right away. They're already immediately repeating something. Right? It's just like the 2, 4, 6, 8. God said, let this happen. Waters below gathered into one place. And then God called this dry land that. He called this. He called that. And then it was good. Then the earth sprout vegetation. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning the third day. So days 1 through 3 come to completion. What happens in days 1 through 3? Did you notice anything? There's repetition, obviously. There's creation. There's God saying. And then there's it happening, and then there's it was good, and then there's also its days passing, right?
There was evening and
What are the patterns? Well, there's an obvious day pattern, but then even below that, there's God says it is, and He sees it good. He says it is, and He sees it good. He says it is, and He sees it good. And He's also doing what? Calling things, right? Which is something He allows Adam to do later, but not Eve, right? In my translation, I have and God said.
yeah,
But what do you guys have?
and God said.
Yeah, so we have then in one translation, right? There's one Hebrew word. It's actually not even a word, it's a letter, and it gets repeated all throughout Scripture. It's the letter Vav with a little tiny vowel. It's one of the most basic words. It's essentially the consonant V with a little vowel, and then it's the most basic way in Hebrew to connect sentences together, right? In English, we have a whole bunch of words that allow us to do that. And, but, if, then, right? In Hebrew, Vav is the most simple, right? Then, therefore, so that. In Hebrew, most often they just use the V. If there's a V in front of a word, it's usually they're connecting sentences. Our English translators are interpreting the translation, interpreting that vowel to mean then when they say then, right? But then implies what? Sequence, right? Then implies sequence. But there is no implied sequence in Vav, right? Which is and is the most basic and correct translation. And God said. And God. So these could be simultaneously happening events. They could be in quick succession. They could be in long succession. We don't have, it's ambiguous, right? It's a good example where the same Hebrew letter appears differently in various translations. Sometimes it's and, sometimes it's then, sometimes it's thus, right? But it functions most likely as an and. And I think they chose to do it here because those paragraphs already have day built into the sentence. You see it? One unit has day 1, one unit has day 2, so the translators feel comfortable implying then. Do you see that? That's a choice that the translator makes, right? And so the last one in verse 11 occurs within day 3. What's day 3? The last and. Verse 11. Yeah. Each day begins with God said. Each day ends with there was evening and morning. Day 1, day 2, day 3. Right? It's very clear. There's a little frame of repetition there. And then God said, some speaking, some activity, and then evening, morning, right? God said, God made, God called, evening, morning. The formula appears 6 times within the narrative, the same closing and opening, right? What else is repeated?
God so, of course, God so.
There's the God saw. There's also good, the Hebrew word tov, right? How many distributions of good are there?
So, 4, 10, 12, 18, 21, 25, and 31.
Yeah,
7.
right? In day one, let there be light, saw that it was good. In the second one, for the vault, what does he say about the vault? He doesn't say anything about the vault, but what does he say about the waters that are separated? He calls that good, right? Vegetation, good is back. Water, good is back, right? Why is there not one on the second day?
What?
On the second day, is there good?
The second day, none. There was no good.
Yeah, why? Yeah, that's a great question, but we never think about it. We talk about how complete it is, but second day there's not. Why?
And the expanse. Yeah, and the expanse. And then that will be probably settled in day number 4.
If you look at the whole text, the repetition of good is so prevalent that the absence of good on the second day sticks out like a sore thumb. And the presence of two goods on day 3 becomes extra significant, right? That's interesting. Why? It's as if we're making for lost good on day 2. That's one way to think about it. It's not clear, right? We're working with a poetic narrative text. What is that? Yeah, he called off on day 2. See, once you actually start to read slowly, you'll catch these things that are worth asking a question of. What's so interesting is that this is how some historical interpreters of this passage have interpreted it. Like he called off on day 2, or we're making up for lost good on day 2, right? And there's a sense that this whole account is human-centered, about God creating the environment for human. So that's why on day 3, when humans are, the environment for humans are there, it's really, really good, right? On day 1, it's something that's absolutely necessary for humans to do what they're going to do on day 6, is have day 1 light and darkness contain, right? Although you could live on one of the poles of planet Earth and live in 6 months of darkness, or what is it in the poles? How many months of darkness do you experience in Antarctica? I think it's 6 months, right? 6 months out of the year is almost complete darkness, right? On day 3, what you get is dry land and food on the dry land. Is that good for humans? Yeah, it's good for humans. Dry land is good for humans. Day 1, is night and day good for humans? Yeah? Is separated waters good for humans? Right? But they don't go in the water, typically, right? Maybe you can sail, but people didn't really sail. So that's some historical interpretation. There's no good on the second day because humans don't go in water, right? Some people have interpreted that way. They go on land. So when land is made, it's really good. It's good twice, right? Day 2, waters are separated. Humans can't go there. They don't go up into the sky, and they don't go into the water, so no good. Is that a good interpretation of it? You can think about it, right? It's worth thinking about. So it's as if the distribution of the good is giving us a clue as to what good means. Good means dry land. Good means day and night, right? Before it was just dark, but now light's here, so good. Before there was no dry land and there was no food, but now there is, so good, right? Yeah. Good in Genesis 1 is about when we make concrete steps forward into a place where humans can flourish. Many historical Jewish interpreters have noticed that, right? It's hard to live in the water. People who sail still need to go back on land. People who go up into the sky still need to come back down. So good because land and light are good. That's a historic interpretation, right? That's God's definition of good. If it's good for human flourishing, then it's good, right? Day 2, we don't make headway there, right? It needs to be separated before dry land can appear, right? You need day 3 to deliver the goods on what day 2 began. So that's why they say we're making up for lost time on day 2, right? Does that make sense, though? This is a poetic interpretation. Now we're reading into structure and repetition and where it's repeating and where it's not repeating and what it could mean for the author, right? We're going to continue to look at Genesis next week, but here's where we are, at the precipice of understanding just how much weight repetition can hold in readings of the text. You see? Right? So we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of Genesis 1 as we continue, and we'll look at all the other things. We'll start to look at even more Hebrew words that get repeated, and we'll see how similar roots get repeated, but different variations of words end up being the linking points. So tov means good, not like moral good, just good or beautiful, right? So let's think about the context. When does Mazel Tov get said?
Celebration, weddings, or bar mitzvah, or
Yeah. So
is that a toast?
yeah. So where do you get what are some examples of where we'll hear Mazel Tov?
Weddings, bar mitzvah. Do they say bar mitzvah?
So bar mitzvahs, births. It's a boy, Mazel Tov. Okay. So mazel is actually a really interesting word. Its original root meaning, right? The mazel, the root, is its association to astrology. Actually, it means to look at the stars, and so like auspicious or good fortune. That's what it's like. Yeah, or like things lined up for you, right? And so I wish you much mazel, and you can say I miss you much tov. But when you say mazel tov together, it's like good fortune or like great, congratulations. That's what it functions as. But it actually is in Hebrew in our text. It's mostly associated with idol worship, actually, because idol worship usually happens in conjunction with stars. So, yeah, astrology. And so that's why we can say fortune, right? Because through the association with pay attention to stars, its new metaphoric meaning, it developed into like good things, right? So, but that's interesting. So it's a little bit of a deep cut. That's it. All right. Any questions before we close? Okay. I'm going to close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this opportunity to once again study and to dive into things like poetry and things like the Hebrew language. Lord, would you make it profitable for us to continue studying this as the weeks go on? In your name we pray, amen.